Hi everyone, so I got a request to compare the E-M10 Mark II versus the E-M5 Mark III. And maybe you have the E-M10 Mark II now and you're thinking about upgrading to the E-M5 Mark III. So what I'm going to do is just point out a few differences or key differences between the two cameras to help you make that decision. Now, when you look at these two cameras side by side, there's really not much difference between the two cameras, whether it's the E-M10 Mark II or the E-M10 Mark III. They're very, very similar in size and weight. The only difference being is really in the grip. The E-M5 Mark III has just a little deeper grip than the E-M10 Mark II, but it's pretty much the same as the E-M10 Mark III. So ergonomically, they're virtually the same, but there are some functional differences on the exterior. Now, the E-M5 Mark III has 3 additional buttons outside that you can program and a lever. So there's one right here by the lens on the front, and then they've also added another button here with the switch, and then there's an extra button up here on the power switch. The other button here is just a viewfinder toggle, which is available on the E-M10 Mark II, but they put it over here on the side on the viewfinder instead. So really there's 3 more buttons and a lever here to change function modes. So I think the extra buttons do add some significant functionality to the camera, being able to access the lever button, the AFL button by default. These are all reprogrammable, and then the one button here right next to the lens just makes for just better use one-handed. You can do depth of field preview, you can do back button focus now much easier, and with the lever you can change focusing modes, or you can switch from video to photography mode and back and forth, and then it also can act as a power switch, so you can quickly turn the camera on with just the switch. So it's all programmable, and I can talk about those in another video. Now, another major difference on the body is the screen, because the E-M5 Mark III has a fully articulating screen, so you can point it up 180 degrees or point it down 180 degrees, and then of course you can flip it all the way around so that you can do selfies or do some vlogging. And you know, it's just kind of a nice thing to have. But I think for photography, you know, I prefer just this regular tilt screen. Now on the E-M10 Mark II, you can flip it up 180 degrees and then tilt down up to 45 degrees. You know, in the field and in practice, I prefer this if I'm just doing photography. But that's another key difference. And another difference on this camera is the pop-up flash here. The E-M5 Mark III does not have one, but on the E-M10 Mark II, you can just pop up this flash, and it's kind of nice to have for those times when you can't get the shot unless you have a flash. It's also nice for doing just a little mild fill-in maybe. You know, whereas the E-M5 Mark III, you know, it comes with a separate small flash that you can attach to the top. I think it's an FL3. I never really use it, but that's another key difference between the two cameras. Now, also the E-M5 Mark III has the same USB and HDMI ports as the E-M10 Mark II, but the USB port is now able to charge the battery in camera. And you can't use the camera while it's charging, but it is handy for those times when you're, say, out doing street photography and then you stop and have some lunch. You can sort of top off your battery while you're having your coffee and lunch, for example, and then when you're done, you can go back out and just have a little more charge than when you left. Also, it has a mic jack and a remote shutter jack. So it has a 2.5 millimeter remote shutter jack, and then it also has a 3.5 millimeter standard microphone jack. Another difference is in the battery door, where they do now both use the same battery. It's a BLS5 or BLS50. However, on the E-M5 Mark III, they've moved the memory card out of the battery compartment into the camera on the side here, so you can access the memory card without going through the battery door. And this is handy, for example, if you're on a tripod a lot, and it allows you to swap the memory card without having to take the camera off the tripod. But again, in practice, I found I change the battery more often than I change the memory card. And then one other small handling difference with the E-M5 Mark II, you can get grips for either camera, But if you get the factory grip for the E-M5 Mark III, that grip has an additional shutter button extended out onto the grip, so it just gives you a little easier handling. However, they don't offer any sort of extra battery grips or any kind of grips where you can do some kind of vertical shooting. Now let's talk about some of the technical differences. The E-M10 Mark II has a 16 megapixel sensor and the E-M5 Mark III has a 20 megapixel sensor. And I think, again, in practice, there's not much difference between the two. You may be able to crop in slightly more and get that tad bit more resolution out of the E-M10 or E-M5 Mark III, but I don't think in any practical sense it's that much difference. Now, continuing with image quality in terms of high ISO noise or low noise performance, again, there's not much difference between the two cameras. I think Olympus claims maybe 2/3 of a stop better performance with the E-M5 Mark III. But let's go over to the computer now, and I took a couple of test shots to kind of show you that difference. It's really not that much. So I'll just run you through a couple of quick test shots here. I have my E-M10 Mark II on the left and E-M5 Mark III on the right. And as you can see, for the most part, they're virtually identical. Like I said, you may be able to crop in a tiny bit more on the E-M5, but I think for all intents and purposes, there's not much difference here. Now let's compare like ISO 6400 and look at the difference between these two. And again, the E-M10 on the left, the E-M5 on the right, and virtually no difference even at ISO 6400. I can still make out all of the text in here and the fine print. There's just not enough noise here to worry about. And I haven't done any editing to these pictures. And then let's just jump up to 12,800. And again, now I start to see a tiny bit more color noise in the E-M10 and less over here, but that's so easily cleaned up without really losing any detail, I think. And then let's compare it ISO 25,600. And we'll just go here. And, you know, in the lighter areas, I really don't see much difference. And then let's go back down here where there's some good shadows. And at 25,000, they're almost virtually the same again. And then I'll show you how easily it is to clean up the noise here. I'll just develop one and reduce the color noise by some number. We'll do the same thing on the E-M5 and let's compare them again. Give it a second and you can see that at 25,000, once I've removed most of the color noise, yeah, at this ISO, there is a little bit less granular noise. But in practice, I don't think it's that much difference. Now, going on with ISO, both cameras have very similar ISO ranges. I believe the E-M5 Mark III will go from 64 up to 25,600, and on the E-M10 you can go from like 100 up to 25,600. And both cameras have a very sophisticated auto ISO system that takes into account, you know, your aperture, your shutter, and the focal length of the lens. However, the E-M5 Mark III has one additional setting that allows you to set the maximum shutter speed. So I can set the shutter speed, say, to 6 seconds on the E-M5 Mark III and tell the camera that don't raise the ISO unless you go beyond a 6-second shutter speed, so a very long exposure. And on the E-M10 Mark II, you're pretty much limited to, I've seen it go down to 1/20th of a second in silent mode, and I believe the minimum is 1/60th of a second in mechanical shutter mode. And there's some times when I've seen it go a little bit lower than that, but for the most part, you don't have any sort of maximum shutter speed that you can set on the E-M10 Mark II. Now, speaking of 6-second exposures, another significant difference between the two cameras is in the image stabilization, or the IBIS on the camera. The E-M5 Mark III has a much better image stabilization system. They claim 5.5 stops with the camera only, and then if you add a lens, you can get up to 6.5 stops. And on the E-M10 Mark II, it's limited to 4.5 stops, and then there's no way to combine or get dual image stabilization when you add an image stabilized lens. And in practice, what does that mean? Well, on the E-M10 Mark II, I can usually get down to maybe 1 second if I'm really steady exposure, and still get it relatively sharp, but it's a little iffy there. You know, I like to be at 1/20th of a second at most on that camera to get a sharp image, but the E-M5 Mark III, I easily get, you know, 4, 5, 6 seconds handheld if I'm very, very steady. So it's really, in practice, a much better image stabilization system, especially if you can combine lenses that have image stabilization with it. And I'm talking about handheld without an image stabilized lens, just using the in-camera image stabilization. It's also a pretty significant difference in video as well. And you're going to get much smoother shots in video with the E-M5 Mark III than you would with the E-M10 Mark II. And I did a comparison between the E-M1 Mark II and the E-M10 Mark II video image stabilization that you can check out. I'll put a link to it down in the show notes, but it is pretty substantial there as well. Not that the E-M10 Mark II is that bad. It's certainly better than most systems out there already that are not Olympus, but the E-M5 Mark III takes it to another level. Now, continuing with exposure, let's talk about the shutter speeds. Both these cameras have virtually unlimited long exposure type shutter speeds. You can go into bulb mode, live composite, live time, etc. But on the faster end, the mechanical shutter on the E-M10 Mark II and E-M10 Mark III is limited to 1/4000th of a second. And the E-M5 Mark III can go up to 1/8000th of a second. And on silent mode, the E-M10 Mark II is a 1/16,000th of a second. And on the E-M5 Mark III, you can go up to 1/32,000th of a second. So there are some applications for that. I mean, me personally, I can probably count on one hand how many times I've shot faster than 1/4000th of a second. But, you know, if you're into sports photography, maybe motorsports photography, you're going to go into 1/8000th, 1/16,000th, maybe 1/32,000th of a second all the time. You know, you want to freeze those, maybe it's a drag racing, you want to freeze the cars flying off the line with the tires swelling and all of that. So there are some applications for very high speed shutters, you know, over and above, say, high speed shutter sync type photography, where maybe that extra stop at 1/8000th of a second may save the image. Now, continuing on with the shutter mechanism, there are also some significant differences here as well. In continuous low, where you can maintain continuous autofocus, meaning the camera is going to refocus every time it takes a picture, the E-M10 Mark II in mechanical mode is 4 frames per second, and in silent mode, it's 5 frames per second. On the E-M5 Mark III, you have 6 frames per second mechanical and 10 frames per second silent mode with continuous autofocus. In continuous high, the camera will lock focus on the first frame and then maintain that focus point for the rest of the images through that burst. And on the E-M10 Mark II, it's 8.5 frames per second mechanical, 11 frames per second silent. But on the E-M5 Mark III, it has a 10 frame per second mechanical, but a 30 frame per second electronic shutter, and that's raw capture. It also has a pro capture mode where it'll pre-buffer before you actually take the image. It'll take up to 14 images before you fully depress the shutter button, and then continue on to 30 frames per second with that. And that's useful, say, for maybe you have pressed the shutter button to focus on a bird, maybe on a branch, and you hold that shutter button until he takes off, and then you push it all the way down as soon as the bird takes off. And that way, it'll give you a little more wiggle room to capture that right moment, right? Because you'll have the 14 frames before you push the shutter button and then up to 30 frames per second after. And you may be able to catch the bird right when it leaps off the branch, or maybe it's a kingfisher diving into the water, and you can capture that moment right when his beak just touches the water, right? You know, so the Pro Capture mode makes things like that a lot easier. And I'm sure you can think of a lot of other creative ways to use Pro Capture. Now, in terms of focusing, I found that the single point autofocus is pretty reliable on both cameras, but the E-M5 Mark III will focus in much lower light. And, you know, like if it's twilight, I think both cameras will do a good job in single point autofocus, but once it gets pitch black, I notice when I do my street photography, the E-M10 Mark II will struggle from time to time when I only have, say, the city lights or lights through windows coming, and the camera will struggle a little bit to focus on that. Whereas the E-M5 Mark III, I have a much higher level of confidence. And I did 2 vlogs back to back, one with the E-M10 Mark II and one with my E-M1 Mark II, which has the same focusing system as the E-M5 Mark III, where you'll see that time to time the E-M10 Mark II did struggle a little bit, whereas the E-M1 Mark II had no problems at all. And another significant difference in the focusing is in the continuous autofocusing and tracking. The E-M10 Mark II does have continuous autofocus with tracking, but the tracking function is virtually useless. And in continuous autofocus, say with birds in flight, for example, I'm getting about a 40–50% hit rate in terms of using continuous low shutter speed with the continuous autofocus, using single point or 5-point groups. But on the E-M5 Mark III, I'm getting closer to 60–70% hit rate with my birds in flight photography. And I'm sure that will improve because I know other photographers, they're claiming 80–90% hit rates with their birds in flight with the continuous autofocus and tracking. So it is a superior autofocus system between low light and tracking. And also in video mode, it's also much better. It's able to do face detect much better than the E-M10 Mark II. And the fact that it's phase detect, you'll also get much smoother transitions, especially when you're doing focus pulls and things like that. And then there's also some additional settings for sensitivity and things like that. So it has a much more sophisticated focusing system in the E-M5 Mark III. Now, the last few things are some of the features that are available on the E-M5 Mark III that are not available on the E-M10 Mark II or Mark III. Now, both cameras, they do have focus bracketing where you can set the camera to take X number of pictures and then step the focusing between each image. But the E-M5 Mark III adds focus stacking where it'll take up to 8 images and then stack those back together in camera. Because with focus bracketing, normally you have to bring those 8 or 10 pictures back into a post-processing software to stack them back together. But the E-M5 Mark III will do 8 pictures in camera. Another feature the E-M5 Mark III has is something called high-res shot mode, where you can take up to a 50 megapixel or 80 megapixel image by shifting the image sensor around. So you have to be on a tripod because it turns off the image stabilization. And then at that point, it'll generate, a 50 megapixel or 80 megapixel RAW file. And that's really good for I think subjects that are close up and, for landscape photography to some extent. You will get higher resolution images from the E-M5 Mark III with that feature. And another nice feature the E-M5 Mark III has is the lens profile feature. So if you like adapting vintage lenses or lenses from other systems, you can put into the camera what lens you put on and what aperture and focal length so that the camera will automatically adjust the image stabilization to the focal length of the lens, and then also save all of that information into the EXIF data of the file. So what that means is when you bring it back into your post-processing software, you'll be able to identify which lens you used, even though that lens may not have the electrical contacts available to it to tell the camera what lens is on there. And I found it pretty handy because I'll bring some images back in with my E-M10 Mark II, for example, and I'll have to try to remember what lens I used and make just some keywords or add notes to that image, versus the E-M5 Mark III, it'll actually save that directly into the EXIF data that's available to any kind of post-processing software. And then there's also a couple of more art filters, but more significantly in the autofocus system, the E-M5 Mark III has a focus limiter function where you can tell the camera what range or area that you want the camera to focus in. So you can set it to say, focus on everything between 100 meters and 200 meters, you know, if you're doing, say, some sort of wildlife photography. So it's not going to hunt or accidentally focus on that blade of grass right in front of you. Or you can set it for like street photography and lock it in between 5 millimeters or 5 meters and 5 meters, so that the camera will just focus on one spot every time, so you can quickly acquire that image in street photography. So it's flexible, and you can adjust that in camera. So in summary, really, the E-M10 Mark II is a fabulous camera. It takes great pictures and has, 90% of the features of the E-M5 Mark III. But where the E-M5 Mark III really excels is in the low light focusing capability, the image stabilization, the continuous autofocusing with tracking, and then also it makes a great hybrid camera for video for vloggers because of the fully articulating screen and the mic jack. And also it has some additional 4K cinema 4K video modes that aren't available on the E-M10 Mark II. So, and that's really the reason that I bought the camera, is because I'm a hybrid shooter and I typically vlog and take pictures with just this one camera, and it provides it in a nice compact system that I really loved on the E-M10 Mark II.